For Family by Nanook 888. Chapter 9. The Rescue. Part 1. The decommissioned droid foundry was a silent, lifeless tomb concealed deep under the barren surface of Geonosis. There was neither sight nor sound of a single active droid or native Geonosian. Dated, discarded transports, damaged droid parts, and abandoned equipment littered the ground, making progress slow and treacherous in the hazy gloom. The group avoided using glow rods, which would have easily flagged their position and blinded them to anything beyond the sphere of light, instead relying largely on faint emergency lights still clinging to the last vestiges of power from their backup fuel cells. Where even these had succumbed to the deathly sleep of time, stranding them in pitch darkness, the green glow of Luke's lightsaber was pressed into service. 3 right, 4 left. The group nodded at Leia's signal and split off into respective numbers. They followed her and Luke as the two led the way along opposite sides of the wide corridor, one sensing for any traps laid by Boba Fett with the Force, while the other used a more obvious portable scanner. They moved cautiously but steadily as they zeroed in on the coordinates provided by Vader. Bounty hunters employed by Vader to pursue Boba Fett away from Jabba's palace reported that Slave 1 had been severely damaged and crash-landed in the bowels of the droid foundry. Extensive repairs would be required to make the ship space-ready again, but how far into those repairs Fett might be, and how much time they had left to rescue Han, was anybody's guess. Halt! Get down. It was Luke's signal this time, and the two groups hugged opposite walls as they hunkered down in a part of the passageway not immediately distinguishable from any other. Mizé, not as sure-footed as the others, misjudged the available distance and knocked into Tran, forcing him into the wall with a grunt. Leia shot the lanky, brown-haired youth a sharp glare over her shoulder, which was returned with a sheepish grin. Along with Kara, the two had volunteered and been authorized by Mothma to join the rescue party. Leia was somewhat skeptical that their claim of simply wishing to rescue a fellow Corellian was reason enough to volunteer for a mission where the intel was being provided by Vader, especially considering Han's charming personality that didn't exactly endear him to many people. But they had steadfast, proven loyalty to the rebellion, and Leia could think of no justifiable reason to refuse them. Kara's explanation that she had lived, flown, and fought alongside Chewie and Lando and wished to aid their friend was much more believable. Luke, still crouched, took half a step forward and paused again, apparently studying the floor intently. Lando peered down beside him as well, trying to see what the Jedi saw, but it was only when he gave up and looked away that he saw something out of the corner of his vision. He looked down again, but this time unfocused his eyes and used his peripheral vision, and in the faint glow of an emergency light they had passed several places behind, he could just about make out a hairline fracture scrawling a ragged line across the floor before them. He followed the jagged splinter from one side of the corridor to the other and along the foot of the wall on his side. He glanced at Luke to find the young man had closed his eyes, and he was so still that if Lando didn't know any better, he would have sworn that the Jedi had fallen asleep on his haunches. The others were impatient to get going, but they had faith in him and waited quietly, too well trained to fidget. Luke's eyes abruptly flew open. He rose to his feet, stretched forth his hand. With a thundering groan that reverberated underfoot, a huge chunk of the durasteel floor before them was torn asunder along the fracture from wall to wall. The cross-section edge of the floor with snapped cables and protruding struts elevated before them, swinging high above their heads, continuing until it started bending backwards on itself, further and further as the screeching continued to fill their ears, until at long last it came to a quiet rest upside down on the other side. Luke's closer friends calmly looked to him for direction. Tran and Mizé, never having personally witnessed the legendary abilities of the Jedi before, stared wide-eyed at the gaping hole created before them from where a faint orange glow emitted. Kara was a picture of cool indifference. Luke glanced at the others, grinned, and plunged headfirst into the hole. There was a soft gasp from Leia as they all rushed to the edge. They found themselves staring down from the ceiling of an immense cavern that must have comprised the main bulk of the droid foundry. The enormous facility was filled with a jumbled mishmash of conveyor belts and transport pipes stretching every which way at numerous different heights. Thin beams of orange and yellow light along various support struts cast eerie shadows of suspended mechanical arms into the murky gloom. Giant vats now lay empty, but would once have contained molten metal with steam vent funnels gaping above them alongside connecting tubes. Movement caught their eye. Luke was waving to them from a raised platform slightly to their right, a dizzyingly long drop from their elevated passageway, but still only halfway down to the factory floor. Meeting Leia's eyes, he raised an arm out across the huge factory. She followed the line of his arm and pointing finger. There, on the far side of the huge cavern, before a comparable hole blasted into the wall, was the unmistakable outline of Slave 1.
His orders did not make sense, my lord. He only ever repeated 2 phrases and was unable to hold a conversation. We were given sufficient doubt that we sought to verify his identity by submitting a request to the Imperial Palace. Are you in any doubt as to my identity, Captain?
Anakin demanded in Vader's ominous rumble. It was with the greatest reluctance that he exerted a faint pressure on the man's windpipe, knowing the importance of maintaining his Darth Vader persona. But it would not be for much longer. One way or another, with or without Palpatine's death, the guise would soon become redundant. For Luke's sake, and for the sake of the entire galaxy, he promised himself that it would most definitely be with. Vader's infamy was known throughout all corners of the galaxy, and the captain was gripped with terror from the tales of the Dark Lord's invisible hand of death. Even without the light pressure on his throat, he probably would have imagined it, and he was shaking his head frantically as he broke out in a cold sweat.
No, Vader, no doubt whatsoever, my lord.
He hastened to reassure.
That is fortunate,
Anakin drawled, releasing the man with considerable relief and hooking his thumbs into his utility belt.
Where is the imposter now?
The captain drew a shaky breath.
He was last seen leaving by the 3rd passage.
Leaving, Anakin interrupted. All color was quickly draining from the man's face.
We shall locate him at once, my lord, and report with all speed. See that you do, Captain,
Vader said, pointing a threatening finger. With his swirling cape spelling his displeasure, he marched into the captain's office that he had procured for himself and sealed himself in. They all scared a fiber cord grappling hook down to one of the conveyor belts crisscrossing the factory, where they were joined moments later by Luke. They made their way stealthily towards Slave 1 under cover of the numerous other conveyor belts, platforms, vats, supporting turrets, barrels, and crates that surrounded them. They were halfway there when the Force drew Luke's attention. He glanced back to see Tran was reaching for leverage to hoist himself up onto the platform to follow the rest of the group. Luke's gaze narrowed in on the thin wire running alongside the edge, not visible from Tran's ankle, and instinctively Luke knew it was bad news. He also knew it was too late, but still he reached out with the Force in a bid to draw him back. Tran's fingers tapped the wire. The effect was instantaneous. With a deep rumble, the droid foundry lurched to life with assembly lines whirring into movement and various machinery and deactivated engineer droids springing into action to fulfill the sole purpose for which they had been programmed, to create droids. The Force screamed at him a split second before the giant metal press came thudding down straight on top of them. There was no time to shout any warning. Luke repelled Leia with the Force, throwing them both clear from its deadly path in opposite directions. Leia crashed into Lando as they went tumbling on the other side from Luke, who rolled back towards Gara and Chewie.
Luke,
came Anakin's concerned voice into his head, having picked up on the wording in the Force. There was a succession of booming thuds as other metal presses began smashing down further along the conveyor belt, which had abruptly lurched to life. They were now being carried along beneath mechanical hands and contraptions attempting to mold and attach droid parts, heedless of whether any human or Wookiee parts were snagged in the process. A metal arm fitted with a sonic blade came whizzing across at Leia and Lando's head. "Look out!" Luke shouted, but fortunately the two of them were already leaping sideways to avoid being beheaded, just as Chewie shoved Luke and Gara away from a robotic arm, punching down a series of bolts before them. "Leia!" Luke called instinctively. "We're fine!" came her answering call over the din of the machinery. He could just about see her and Lando through the rise and fall of the metal presses in between them. Somehow, in amongst dodging the lethal contraptions and keeping an eye out for his friends, Luke managed to find the spare mental capacity to reply to his anxious father. "It's a good bet Boba Fett knows we're here. He's reactivated the droid assembly." The responding wave of concern emanating from his father was expected, but Luke was perplexed to see that it also carried the deep sorrow he was coming to associate with memories of his mother. It occurred to him then that a trace of it had been there ever since the Falcon had appeared over Geonosis, although he had been too distracted with thoughts of Han and later Mara Jade to register what little of it leaked through his father's shields. "Father, what is it?" Anakin seemed to give himself a mental shake.
Not now, son. You need to focus. You have to get out of there. You can get through, but you must be careful, he cautioned.
"When am I ever not careful?" Luke replied perfectly innocently, just as he was forced to leap sideways to avoid being thrown up in the air. A section of the conveyor belt abruptly lurched up, spun upside down, and jammed straight back down to mash two lumps of metal together. His father's response was unintelligible, but sounded suspiciously like a growl. "We'll go round!" Leia shouted from an increasing distance away. "Stay with Lando!" Luke hollered back, hopefully while they were still within hearing range. He spotted Tran and Mazay, who were sheltering under another conveyor belt slightly above and running off at a tangent to his own. They appeared to have found the only safe stationary spot in the entire factory and looked loath to leave it. "You two work together. Make your way to Slave 1. He followed after Kara and Chewie as they navigated their own cautious way towards Fett's ship. And Han. Anakin paced the small office like a trapped crate dragon. He could confidently launch headfirst into battle, lead him into victory against hordes of enemy soldiers, and strategize brilliant battle plans, but all this infernal waiting while his son headed into an encounter with Boba Fett in the middle of a reactivated droid foundry was beyond his sparse reserves of patience. He glared at the small remote resting upside down and tilted against the wall on the desk where he had previously cast a decided frustration. He took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down, reminding himself that Luke was a Jedi. He could handle the droid foundry. After all, Padme had... Anakin immediately clamped down on that train of thought. Luke did not need the destruction of his father's memories right now, especially considering how he had already picked up on it during the earlier labs and concentration. Despite Anakin's best attempts at keeping his inner turmoil concealed, being in the very place that had sparked his and Padme's relationship was proving too much of a strain. The memories were clamoring for attention, struggling to break free of his control. He cast another blanket of shielding over it all, but he knew that he couldn't keep them hidden from Luke's perceptiveness for long. The boy's affinity with the Force was remarkable, picking up on the faintest traces floating in the Force. Padme would have been so proud. He brought himself up short again and huffed in irritation. Evidently, all this waiting was doing him no good, and he was more likely to endanger Luke with his distracting thoughts. Abruptly setting his mind in resolve, he marched forward, snatched up the remote, and depressed the switch before he could change his mind for the 10th time. Luke cautiously peered around from behind the counter of an old barrel peppered with rusted holes. Slave 1 rested some 30 paces away on a raised platform, and the bounty hunter was making fast work of replacing a patch of hull plating with a sonic welder and mesh tape. To Luke's dismay, it looked as if the internal repairs had been completed sufficiently for Boba Fett to make his leave. He reached for Leia's presence and located her towards the bow of the ship. Focusing that way, he could make out a few dark curls of Lando's hair over the top of the platform. He slid back down and turned to his companions. "Leia?" "Lando," he mouthed and indicated a ship, then over on the other side. Chewie nodded and waved his bowcaster. "Distraction." Luke grinned, glancing at Kara to convey the same. "Mara!" a voice corrected in the back of his head, which he firmly pushed aside for the time being. He drew his blaster, leaving his lightsaber attached to his belt. Luke nodded once. Then they were charging out in a full belt, firing everything within their arsenal and creating a considerable ruckus. To his credit, as if he had been expecting them that very moment all along, Boba Fett simply threw himself sideways into a roll, came up in a crouch, and engulfed them in flames. The voice had sang it in warning, and Luke was already waving his hand, throwing up a flat Durasteel sheet that must have once comprised the side of an old crate as a shield. Fett promptly bombarded them with a torrent from his powerful EE-3 rifle fire. Chewie's growling turned into a raging roar as he dove for cover with his companions, the fur on his shoulders smoking from where the flame cone had come too close for comfort. Both sides maintained the heavy bombardment of the other, moving swiftly from one position to another as soon as whatever decrepit object was providing some flimsy cover exploded under the assault. Luke spotted Leia running towards the open ramp of Slave 1 at one point, but was too busy trying to draw Boba Fett's attention while avoiding the resulting deluge of deadly fire to see whether she had made it into the ship. They made rapid work of demolishing everything, destroying crates, machinery, and equipment, and scattering the area in splintered debris. Soon after, Luke found himself within 20 paces of the yawning mouth of Fett's ship. He waited only a second for Cara and Chewie to start firing back at Boba Fett before he was running in a half-crouch straight for the ship. Before he had gone half the distance, however, an eruption of flames directly before him forced him to lurch to a halt, wheel around and duck behind one of the few crates remaining intact. Cara caught up with him in seconds, throwing herself down and crashing against him as she narrowly avoided a volley of blaster fire by a hair's breadth. "Have you lost your mind?" she hissed at him. He blinked at her obvious anger. "What? Running out in the open? Are you completely crazy?" He shrugged. "Had to be done. Boba Fett can't suspect this is a diversion." There was a pause in the pounding from the bounty hunter's weapons, and Luke threw an arm over the top of the crate to return his fair share of blaster fire. "And you thought getting turned into a roasted delicacy was the way to do that?" Even amidst all the very real danger of their current situation, Luke couldn't help the almost shy, teasing grin that appeared on his face. "Hey, were you worried?" Her green eyes flashed at him in hot indignation just before she seemed to remember herself, and her whole demeanor shifted into a mask of concern. "Of course I was, you mophead," she said with a faint kindness. "Somebody has to knock some sense into you. You're no good to anyone dead." Even knowing that she was Mara Jade, the Emperor's hand, it was startling for Luke to see her Cara mask slip into place before his very eyes. He wondered what had made her so angry in the first place. But they were immediately running again as the crate exploded beside them. As they flattened themselves against two pillars stretching up into the high ceiling, they saw Leia and Lando sprint down the ramp and away from Slave 1, pushing a hovering slab of metal before them. "Han!" Luke whispered, just as an unmistakable howl deafened him in one ear, telling him that Chewie had caught up with them. Unfortunately, Boba Fett had also spotted them in the same instant and immediately changed the course of his attacks. Luke and Chewie instinctively moved as one, accompanied by the latter's enraged roar as they charged the bounty hunter from behind with no further thought than to prevent him from recapturing their friend. Chewie's long strides ate up the distance between them first, and he collided with Boba Fett in a frenzied, deadly mass of limbs with rifle and bowcaster barely held at bay and firing up way too close to bases for any rational thought. Instinct took over. His lightsaber flew into hand and was activated. The Force was summoned, drawn, molded to his command. He was a Jedi Knight in dark robes with his shining green blade, a picture of perfect calm and sharp relief against the furious activity before him. "Go, Chewie!" Luke ordered in a voice that carried without shouting. In the moment Chewie broke free, Boba Fett made to follow Leia and Lando's retreating forms, but he also cast a glance over his shoulder at Luke at the same time, and the sight pulled him up short. It was as near to a double take as the bounty hunter had ever come. Chewie, with hesitant steps growing gradually more confident, turned and went after Leia and Lando. The ringing of blaster fire and explosions died away, leaving only the background hum of machinery. Luke had no idea why the sight of him had made the bounty hunter pause, or the reason for the astonishing intensity of hate directed solely at him. But he was not about to waste words to find out. It turned out, however, that he didn't need to. "Jedi!" the mechanized voice spat in contempt. It was enough for Luke to know that his presence might well have saved his friends. The two faced off, circling each other in the field of debris. It had taken all of 3PO's powers of persuasion to convince the short droid to stay put, as Master Luke had ordered, but his relief at R2 abruptly changing his mind and ceasing his attempts to leave the Falcon had been short-lived when it soon became apparent that the astromech droid had simply developed another agenda. "Just what are you doing now?" 3PO asked nervously as R2 trundled up to a computer terminal and plugged himself in. For the last few minutes, the golden droid had been watching in anxious confusion as R2 had been rolling backwards and forwards around the Falcon and feeding into the ship's programming here or fusing something there. Still plugged into whatever he was doing, R2 swiveled his domed head to place 3PO in his visual receptor as he responded with a series of bleeps. "What do you mean you're going to help?" 3PO demanded as he listened to the droid. 25 years ago? What are you talking about? R2, you have never been to Geonosis in your life. R2 ignored him and continued with a chain of cheery chirps. No, you know how Captain Solo doesn't like us to touch his ship. He's very particular, you know. There was a series of perfectly unconcerned beeps. Well, 3PO cried in offended astonishment. Don't rely on me to stand up for you when he becomes angry with all your meddling. R2 gave a trill of explanatory whistles. Thank you! 3PO exclaimed. No, I don't think he'll thank you at all. He'll probably have Master Luke sell you back to those Jawas and me as well for not stopping you, and it will be all your fault. R2 spat a raspberry at him before trundling down the corridor. 3PO tottered after him in a vain attempt to restrain his headstrong, defiant counterpart. R2, come back here at once! I haven't finished! Chewie charged on, propelling Han's carbonate slab before him. Leia and Lando ran after him, either dodging or blasting at deadly droid construction units. Chewie howled in frustration as he realized that the conveyor belt abruptly disappeared before him, wrapping under and doubling back beneath them. He rapidly hauled himself and Han's slab to a halt, stumbling a step as his friends smacked into him before they could stop. That's not good! Lando cried. The belt carried them forward as they continued to backpedal, but the thudding noise of giant metal presses behind them alerted them that their options were running out. Here! Leia pulled the grappling hook from her utility belt. Chewie growled, taking the end and waving her forward. She understood. No, Chewie, we need you to take Han. You go on. We'll follow. A thud boomed out directly behind them, cutting off their options. They scrambled to attach a free end to the loop of metal, and Chewie hollered as they all swung off the conveyor belt, clinging to each other just as a large press thudded down where they had been standing. They fell into a large curved vat with a crash. Chewie took one look at the carbonate slab and gave a wretched howl. The repulsors had broken. The slab lay against the curved edge of the vat, a heavy, dead weight. Looking up, they spotted a ladder leading out of the vat, but it ended above Chewie's reach. They would need to stand on each other's shoulders, as well as somehow lifting the considerable weight of the slab. There were more howls of frustration. It's okay, we'll unfreeze him. Lando? Leia prompted. Are you sure? He asked uncertainly. I could do it, but he'll probably have hibernation sickness. It'll be best to have medics on hand. We won't get him out as a carbonate slab, she snapped. But there was a whirring up ahead, and they looked up to see the edge of a funnel appear overhead. It was slowly moving across, as if to align with the vat. Hurry, Lando! He didn't need any more encouragement. There was no way that funnel was about to deliver anything healthy to humans. He began the unfreezing process and prayed that Han would defrost quickly enough. Boba Fett was remarkably agile for a non-force sensitive. He positively flew around the scene of destruction as he brought all his weapons to bear on the focus of his hate. Luke himself was merely a dark blur behind the whizzing green lightsaber, deflecting the deluge of DUR-24 laser and EE-3 rifle fire and nimbly dodging the blazing flames lapping at his heels. The occasional blaster fire sizzled past Luke to distract Boba Fett, the only indication of Gara keeping track of them concealed in the shadows. Luke's primary aim was to impede the bounty hunter long enough for his friends to escape with Han. Had he killed Boba Fett, he would have bought them much more time, but there was a reluctance that stayed his hand on several occasions whenever there was an opening to deliver a lethal blow. It was in pursuit of Luke that his father had initially employed bounty hunters to hunt down his friends, which had initiated the particular sequence of events leading to this moment where Boba Fett now leaped all around him trying to find an opening in his guard. He felt a twinge of responsibility that Fett had ended up being his opponent. Boba Fett was an experienced enough combatant to notice his opponent's restraint. You toyed with fire, Jedi. Luke crouched above him on a conveyor belt, chugging along in jerky movements. There was clearly a broken link somewhere. I don't wish to kill you, he replied calmly, still keenly alert regardless of the lull in their duel. He sensed the answering smirk concealed within the mask moments before Fett aimed his DUR-24 slightly off to Luke's side. Sparks flew as the laser seared through the broken link, then an ear-splitting screech brought the conveyor belt careening down towards the floor. Luke arched through the air, his eyes glancing to measure up the patch of ground where he would land, only to find it suddenly erupt in a blaze thanks to that infernal flamethrower. Luke curled into a ball and drew the force around him like a solid blanket. He felt the heat of the flames, but knew he was safely shielded from it, and in the next instant, he threw the shield outwards, practically a solid mass of the force that was visible and malleable only to him in a sweeping curve towards the bounty hunter. The invisible shockwave knocked the breath from Boba Fett's lungs as he was hurled through the air, smashing backwards into the patch of Slave One's hull that he'd only just repaired with such force that a dazed part of his mind wondered if he would leave a Mandalorian armor-shaped dent. He fell to the floor with a grunt, struggling to refocus on the Jedi. His head felt sluggish, churning nauseatingly, and languid limbs refused to cooperate. He could only stare in morbid curiosity as Luke raised an arm, seeming to cause what looked like an entire mass of shattered debris from the whole foundry floor to float up in the air before the entirety was dumped unceremoniously over his head. Laughter greeted Luke's ears. "How much do you reckon he'd pay to keep us from circulating a hologram of that?" He grinned up at Kara, perched on the ledge above, and spared an amusing glance at the green boots sticking out from under the considerable mound of rubble. "Come on, he's practically concussed, but it won't hold him for long." The outline of Han's body began glowing red, and ever so slowly the carbonite melted away to reveal Han's face, then his hands, and gradually the rest of him. Leia glanced up frantically. The funnel was almost aligned! There was a groan, and she looked down to find Han rolling to the side, slowly nudging himself into a sitting position. He was alive! For a moment she entirely forgot where they were, and she blinked several times, simply staring at him, almost afraid to believe her own eyes. But no! Han was here! He was alive! Ever since Bespin, her fears had fueled a constant state of anxiety within her. But now, confronted with his breathing, moving, undeniably and gloriously alive self, all the tension abruptly dispersed. A choking sound somewhere between a sob and a strangled cry escaped her as her legs turned to jelly with crippling relief, and she tumbled down onto him. There was a grunt, and Han instinctively raised his arms to push his assailant away, but then he caught a glimpse of large, sparkling brown eyes, and he paused. Recognition flashed briefly across his face before it was followed swiftly by confusion and total incomprehension, as though he failed to understand the overwhelming joy itched in her every feature. "Leia?" he asked uncertainly, concern evident even through his croaky voice. He coughed, frowning at his own hoarseness. "What is it?" "Oh, Han!" she managed to choke out as her throat constricted. She shook her head in fond frustration, smiling through the tears pricking her eyes as she pulled him into a fierce embrace. As he tentatively wrapped his arms around her, a roar drew his attention over her shoulder. "Chewie?" The Wookiee's elation, only added to his confusion, increased still further as he gradually registered how his entire body felt as if Gundarks had been fighting over it for dinner. He opened his mouth to question, but the words never left his mouth. A look of dawning horror spread across his face, and tension rippled through his frame. "Vader!" he hissed, and Leia knew he was remembering something of his last conscious moments. Her heart wrenched. How things had changed! However, before she could reassure him, fumbling hands, still numb from their long hibernation, were grasping at the empty space left by his absent holster. "Blast it, Chewie, get Leia out of here! Get me a blaster and I'll hold him off!" During his tirade, he lurched, an odd movement where his upper body jerked as if preparing to stand, but lacking the rest of the movement that usually accompanied it, and his outburst faded in shock as he blinked at his lower limbs, stretched out uselessly before him. "My legs!" But then he shook his head, throwing the matter aside as unimportant for the time being, and he shoved Leia away from him towards his hairy friend. "Chewie, don't just stand there! Get Leia out of here!" "It's hibernation sickness," Lando said from the side, speaking to the other two in the face of Han's temporary confusion. He'll regain use of his legs in time. Han's head snapped up. He might not have remembered being frozen in carbonite yet, but he had no difficulty placing that voice and the betrayal. "Lando! You no good swindler, double-crossing—" Leia had returned to his side and now stopped him with a firm hand over his mouth. The look in her eyes, a baffling combination of affection, urgency, and some inner turmoil he couldn't quite identify. Despair? It wondered, brought him up short. Her firm voice reflected the urgency. "We'll explain fully later, but Vader isn't here, and Lando is a friend. We're in another tight fix we need to get out of first, okay?" Han had never been one to sit back and let things pass him by, but as he shook his head free from her hand and opened his mouth to retort, Leia fixed him with a pointed stare. "Trust me," was the message he received, loud and clear from those deep brown eyes. He hesitated, but her gaze only became more insistent, and he nodded reluctantly. He might have agreed to drop it, but that didn't mean he had to like it. He was throwing Lando a hostile glare when Chewie started hollering beside them. "Funnel?" Han repeated in basic. "What funnel?" The Wookiee was now gesturing wildly up at the ladder as he growled. "Lift you?" Han said in confusion. It was all the translation the others needed. Lando braced himself against the wall of the vat, bending his legs slightly and meshing his fingers to create a foothold on his thighs. "This is not going to work," he complained as the 150-kilo Wookiee went to step up. Leia joined them, drawing it deep within herself to push Chewie up with as much strength as she could muster as he jumped for the bottom rung of the ladder. Harry Paws reached up and just managed to cling on. Lando was gingerly rubbing his legs as Chewie gave a triumphant howl and pulled himself up. He hooked his feet behind the outside bars, ankles resting on the bottom rung, and lowered himself down backwards until he was hanging upside down with his arms swinging in reach of the humans below. Leia grinned. "Brilliant, Chewie!" There was a resonant click above them, and they all glanced up to see the funnel had lied and its mouth was sliding open. They all spoke at once. "What's that?" "No, Han! Leia, give me a hand!" Between them, they somehow managed to throw Han up to grab Chewie's paws, who hauled him up to grab onto the ladder. Han hung there by his arms beside Chewie as Leia was next pulled up. "Go, Leia!" Lando shouted as he reached for Chewie. Leia was loath to leave Han behind even for a second, but she knew there wasn't enough room for all four of them at the bottom of the narrow ladder, and she headed up. When Lando had also secured a hold on the ladder, Chewie righted himself, grabbed Han under one arm, and started hauling his way up after Leia without any obvious hindrance, despite having one limb laden down. Lando brought up the rear, and they all rushed up the ladder, falling over the lip of the vat at the top. Lando snatched his legs up after him as a torrent of glowing amber liquid gushed down the funnel amidst a great spurt of steam. Lying in a heap on the ledge circumventing the tank, they stared as a molten metal pool rapidly filled the space they had just vacated. Even through his incomprehension of what was going on, it was Han who found his tongue first. "Never a dull moment, huh?" he mused with a lopsided grin. He received only a deafening howl as warning before he was caught up in a hairy, bone-crushing hug. "I'm alright, pal," he managed to say through his squashed lungs, patting Chewie's arm. There was a series of ominous clicks. Their heads snapped up, and they found themselves staring down the barrels of a dozen E5 blaster rifles. Luke and Cara dodged and ducked and dove their way along the lethal assembly line, still thudding and drilling and whizzing away, creating droids, generally heading towards the side of the huge cavern in the direction the others had taken. They paused when they stumbled across a rare, sheltered, quiet spot at an intersection between three adjoining belts. Luke pointed out an access tunnel halfway up the wide expanse of wall. "The docking stations are closer to the surface. We need to get back to that higher level." They eyed the rapid succession of metal presses booming down along the long, thin belt, trailing up to the dark opening, and looked at each other. "Scared?" Cara's lips were curved in a teasing smile. He grinned back. "No, you?" Her only response was to break for the access tunnel. Luke was hot on her heels as they alternatively sprinted or stopped dead in an attempt to evade the metal presses. The way ahead was clear. 20 more steps and they would be off this deadly conveyor belt and into the relative safety of the access tunnel. They sprinted across, making a beeline for the doorway. 15 steps, now 10, 9, 8... Out of the blue, a giant hammer swung across their path and smashed Cara off the bridge. Aside from the crunching pain as her whole body was clobbered, she was immediately concerned as to where she would end up. There was nothing below them except for a long drop into a metal cruncher. Her body sailed through the air. She was abruptly wrenched to a stop as someone grabbed her left hand. The air was knocked from her lungs with a grunt, and her arm felt as if it would tear out of her shoulder. As her body swung like a pendulum, she looked up to find Luke staring intently down at her, his face tense with exertion as he kept his crushing grip on her with one hand, as the other grasped an adjoining loop jutting out from the side of the conveyor belt. She felt the air swirl around her, and a moment later, incredibly, he hoisted her up with just one arm, high enough that she could grasp the same bit of metal as he had been. He then flipped himself up on the conveyor belt and reached down to haul her up after him. Her right leg gave way in agonizing protest, but Luke caught her and he half carried, half dragged her along with him as they dodged another swinging hammer and finally managed to make it to the relative safety of the tunnel where they collapsed. They lay there, panting, regaining their breath. Everything hurt. Her right leg ached. There was a terrible shooting pain in her ribs with every breath. The right side of her face pulsated and both shoulders throbbed. But even if she felt as if she had just been run over by a stampeding panther herd, she knew she likely would have died had Luke not caught her. "Thank you," she murmured. The Force shifted, turned to regard them, held its breath. It was time. "You're welcome, Mara,"